Today we are in Madrid for the fifth Enel Focus On meeting. We launched this format back in September 2016 in Rome. Then we've been traveling around and we've been to London, to San Francisco and to New York. The Enel Focus On meeting for us is a very important occasion to foster and promote discussion around topics that are very important for us, that impact our lives now and in the future. We launched this event, and we are very happy that you're all here. So first of all, let me thank you. Some of you have been traveled from far away. We have people here from Argentina, from Brazil, from Peru, from Colombia, and of course Russia, Romania, and Italy, and Spain, of course. Today we are going to focus on sustainable solutions for the energy and power industry. And this is a very, very key topic for Enel. Why? Because we are really committed to be decarbonized by 2050 by embracing technology, innovation, and sustainable development. We are going to talk here today with our special guest, Alexis Madrigal, who has been traveling from San Francisco, especially for us, and he's going to give us his special vision about his futuristic vision and also historical perspective on business potential on green technology. But before, I think since it's an amazing group of people, I really would like to have a quick self-intro round so we can all start to get to know each other. So I would say we start from here. So what's your name and where do you come from? And where do you come from?
Malaga.
Oh, maybe we need a microphone, sorry. I think... Otherwise, do you mind if you pass around?
I come from Spain, Sevilla, Malaga.
Hi, my name is Jairo Strachia. I come from Buenos Aires. I'm a journalist in Perfil newspaper, and I have an online channel called Hashtag.
Hi, my name is Gemma. I'm from Malaga, and I'm from the Innovation Center of Tourism in Andalusia.
My name is Giancarlo Falconi. I'm from Peru. I work with startups and innovation center in Peru.
Thank you.
My name is Guillermo Mas. I'm from Alicante, but I live in Barcelona, and I came from Suez, Spain, where I am a business innovation manager.
My name is Sergio. I'm electrical engineer in Siemens Gamesa Renewable Energy. And apart from that, I write articles in several magazines about renewable energies and electric mobility.
My name is Thiago. I'm from Brazil. I'm the founder of Tecnoblog, and Tecnocast is the biggest blog and podcast about technology. And we write about innovation, future, and the use of technology, our relationship.
Hello, I'm Simone Tornabene from Milan. I'm professor of communication strategy and I work with an independent agency in Milan.
Hello, my name is Pablo Martín. I'm from Spain and I'm director of Corresponsables, a magazine about CSR and sustainability.
Thank you. My name is Leandro Africano. I'm a freelance journalist from Buenos Aires, Argentina, and I'm focused on innovation issues.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Antonio Serrano. I am the director of the Masters in Startups of Garrigues and as well the founder of Spartan Hack, which is a business center to create digital profiles.
Hi, my name is Stefan Junestrand and I'm the founder and CEO of Grupo Tecmared, which is a media company. We publish news and articles on a daily basis about sustainability, energy, and new technology, and we also organize congresses with call for papers, etc. on these topics.
Hello, my name is Anton Chupilko. I'm from Russia, from Moscow. I'm a director for innovation AMC companies and board member of Russian Green Building Council. And for maybe 10 years, I promote the sustainable technologies via social networks and via different meetings in Russia and world, and have over 50,000 Twitter followers and the mayors of the top cities in the world. C40 group. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Victor Capra from Romania. I'm a journalist, a tech journalist, and a social media specialist.
Hi, my name is Paco Prieto. I'm coming from Asturias, Spain. I'm focused on innovation and creativity topics, and I work in a company called Talento Corporativo.
Hello, my name is Santiago Villegas. I'm from Colombia. I'm a digital transformation consultant, and right now I work with Confama in the transformation of the libraries around my country into sustainable libraries.
Hi everybody, I'm Rudy Bressa. I'm a journalist. I came from Venice, Italy, and I focus on renewables and climate change issues.
Hi, I'm from Italy as well. My name is Valerio. I work as a journalist for 10 years covering tech and innovation, and I'm now working as a head of digital strategy for Forbes in Italy.
So, thank you, everyone. And I think now, before giving our microphone to Alexis, I would like to introduce you to Mr. Angelo Fraile, who is from Endesa. So he will give us a brief idea of what Endesa is committed at the moment and about the brand. So I leave you the stage to Angelo.
Okay. Thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like again to welcome you to our headquarters of Endesa, and also to thank you for the time you are spending with us, which is very important for us, and also for letting us share with you the thoughts we have on sustainability, on the challenges we're facing, and how we're trying to give the right answer to those challenges. Actually, it's a challenge itself for me to go through this in just 5 minutes and not to take time from Alexis, which I know will be much smarter and deeper in the analysis. But, well, when we talk about Endesa, part of Enel Group, we're talking about companies that have a very long history. In our case, we could go back to 1944 when it was founded Endesa. And it's a history of trying to find smart solutions, best-in-class technological advances to give the right answer to the challenges, the big challenges our societies are facing in that moment. But I wouldn't like to go back to 1944 because it could take, the whole evening. So I just wanted to give you, for those of you who are not familiar to Endesa, a brief overview on us, just to let you know who we are. We are the main operator in the electric sector in Spain and the second largest in Portugal. Some figures, we are 10,000 employees, a little bit more than 11 million customers. We have generation, distribution, and commercialization. So we have around 24 terabytes in installed capacity. Around 70 gigawatts hour produced last year, and around 316, more or less, electric networks. But coming back to, just very briefly, to challenges, we have a lot of challenges out there, and you know about them. We have climate change, we have air pollution, we have natural resources scarcity. We have also the problem of access to electricity for a lot of people that still don't have access to healthy electricity. And we also have this movement of people going to cities. So we have more and more citizens that are more and more capable of organizing themselves, of sharing knowledge, and you are very important also in that. So this is important also for us, because when we are talking about innovation right now, it is not just the innovation that the innovation team can do in Enel. It's the innovation that the whole company can do, but also the innovation that we can bring to the company. And I'm sure that you'll probably be told about this in the visit you're going to be having. So we have a lot of challenges. If we translate, because also technology, as you know, is more and more universal, accessible, affordable, and the maturity curve is sharper every day. So if we translate this into our business, what we find is that we have to go to the decarbonization. We have to go to a new energy model, which is based in the electrification of the society, as we understand that this is the most efficient, not emitting when consuming, and also the most capable of integrating renewable origins source of energy. So we should have to go to a world which is fully electrified with electricity that is 100% renewable. And then we should be having also an increasing active consumer that, as you perfectly know, goes into the prosumer. So probably our role there, and we're investing in that. If you see our business plans, the business plan of Endesa, the business plan of Enel, is to invest in renewables and to invest in making our networks intelligent enough to enable consumers to manage their electricity. I don't want to go much farther on that ideas because I think that maybe Alexis is going to go there, but that's the society in which we are seeing, and it's starting now. And we want to be there, and that's why our industrial plan goes that way. And the most important thing for me, which, you know, I'm a sustainability guy, is that we're not talking any longer about sustainability and industrial plan. What we are talking is that when we do our industrial plan, we have to integrate social, environmental, and ethic concerns and expectations from our shareholders, because that's the only way we are sure that, and we believe, we can ensure long-term value. And we do that, as I've been telling you, when we do our business plan, when we take commitments with the SDGs, with the SDG 13, saying that we're going to be zero emission in 2050, but also establishing intermediate targets for reaching that. Also, when we are setting targets for access to energy, we are setting a target for the whole group of 3 million. So we're doing that by setting clear targets, and also about investment in renewables and in intelligent networks. But we're also doing that, and I would like to finish with that, when we do it in the field. So what we're doing right now is that whenever we are planning to do a new plant, a new installation, it's not just that we look at financial cold numbers. We have to create a creating shared value action plan together with the local community so that we're sure that we are integrating the local expectations too when we are planning our business, so that we are really getting profits for us, for our shareholders, which is very important, but also we are creating positive impact where we are. That's the way we see it. So this is not longer about business and sustainability. Our view is that unless whether you have sustainable business or you don't have business. And in that way, being open to society and to things that can come from abroad is also very important for us. So I will be very happy to share with you all your ideas on that. Okay, so welcome again, and I'll leave. I don't know if it's in 5 or 7 minutes.
No, it's perfect. Thank you, Uncle. Thank you. And we think that now is time to introduce our guest, Alexis Madrigal.
Everyone, I'm Alexis Madrigal. I come to you from San Francisco. I flew in yesterday, and I somehow am not jet-lagged. I slept like straight through the night, like a normal human being last night. And my presentation should be up here shortly, but I'll tell you a little bit about how it's structured. So it's basically 4 questions. 4 questions about the future of power around the globe, and the way that technology and innovation will be woven into the energy that we use in the future. So the reason I decided to do it as sort of questions is that I know we have a lot of valuable expertise in the room, and after I'm done talking, we're actually going to be able to have a discussion that I'm going to moderate, and we're going to be able to sort of discuss these questions and those that come up for all of you. And the reason is, I mean, I'm a journalist, and this is what journalists do, right? We ask questions. I mean, that's the way that we're. See if this thing's working yet. No? Maybe not. Someone want to check that out? Oh, okay. Here, I'll let you do that then. Yeah. Okay. Perfect. There it is. We ask questions, and then we tell stories. And the reason we tell stories is that they're a way of helping us like structure what are really complex systems and ideas into things that we can actually remember. So I know a bunch of you were on the tour. We went to like this sort of operations room where they've got all these energy markets. They have the generation sources. They've got the sort of mechanical batteries that are these pumping stations. All that stuff is very confusing for people who don't work inside the energy industry. And hopefully some of the stories I tell you today will help you sort of understand where those things evolved from. We're going to slide back and forth in time a little bit too. There's a futurist named Kevin Kelly who I worked with at Wired Magazine. And he oftentimes said, as far forward as you want to look twice as far back. So if we're going to look out 50 years, we're probably going to go back about 100 years too. Just a little bit about me for those who are not familiar with my work. Started my career in journalism at Wired magazine there in San Francisco. Went over to the Atlantic where I ran all of our technology, science, and health coverage. For those who aren't familiar with the Atlantic magazine, it was sort of it's one of the longest running magazines in America. It's been around for over 150 years, seen as very influential within the US government as well as sort of broadly in the US. I also made a podcast called Containers, which is really an attempt to reckon with how trade has changed the world and how artificial intelligence may change trade. And of course, the main reason I'm here is I wrote a book about renewable energy technologies called Powering the Dream, which really launched me into kind of thinking about all these systems and how the world really worked beneath just being able to flip on your lights. I also spent a little bit of time as a sort of a wannabe historian, a very history centered mind, and so I spent time at Berkeley at the Center for Science, Technology, Medicine, Society, studying the history of energy technology, and then I more recently have been a visitor at the Berkman Klein Center for the Internet and Society at Harvard. Let's go into the first question. So, when I first got interested in energy issues, I started to wonder, why is it that wind energy is somehow associated with sort of the left in politics? How is it that, given that there were many experiments in solar and wind technology all the way through the 20th century, it still produced just a small amount of the total power for any country, really? And as I dug through these sort of mountains of history around how the world has been powered, I kept finding that the 1970s were an incredible explosion of ideas. I mean, there's a couple of reasons for that. One is the OPEC oil embargo, which ended up sparking all kinds of energy innovation. And two was people just kind of realized the world had limits, that natural resources were not endless. And so during the 1970s, all these people started to reconsider how energy technology worked. And yet when you go and you read now, particularly in the US, but I think across the world, about what was going on during that time period, essentially what you hear is there was just a bunch of hippies playing with solar hot tubs and old windmills. And I think that actually started a lot of people thinking the wrong way about renewable energy technology, that it shouldn't be something that's associated with any particular part of the political spectrum, but that a broad variety of people have actually contributed to the development of these technologies. And I'm going to walk through some of them with you guys now. So I call it the 4 Ts. Back in this time period in the US, people would talk about the 4 Ps of pollution. They were the ways that people sort of tried to deal with all the new environmental problems that people were having after the sort of prosperity of the post-World War II era. And the first T here in the 1970s would be the transcendentalists. So these are the people most people think of when they think of sort of 1970s energy. These are people who tended to live off the grid. They tended to believe that if you changed the energy that you used, that you would actually change yourself. There was actually a path that people would take across the United States visiting these different communes and off-grid places that were doing kind of one-off research. There was a guy named John Nahr who was a photographer who worked with Norman Mailer and Andy Warhol, and he decided he was going to go walk this trail. And he wrote a book called Design for a Limited Planet, where he visited person after person who said things like, this home means that I'm in touch with nature because all the energy we use is provided by the sun. Just all kinds of people who basically thought that the only way that you could make change in society was changing yourself, and the only way you could change yourself was to change the energy that you used. By and large, most of these places are gone. As it turns out, this is really hard research to do on a commune in the middle of nowhere in the United States. And so mostly what we can take from the transcendentalists is just that you did need massive change. Like the planet did have to change. We needed new ways of living, and we needed new ways of getting the energy that we need. There's kind of an associated group. Is anybody in this room familiar with this, the Whole Earth Catalog? Oh, it's fascinating. So the Whole Earth Catalog, this is new information, was an incredible hit in the late 1960s in America, sold several million copies, and was incredibly influential for people who were looking for ways to think about the environment and the world that were sort of not communist or capitalist, that weren't sort of really high technology and also weren't sort of abandoning technology. They tried to chart this other path. And what they focused on was the idea of tools, as you can see here, access to tools. And the reason that was important for people was that tools were sort of the thing that was perfectly matched to the job, right? So for them, the best tools were things that you could use forever. So like pliers, right? They'd find the best pliers and they would actually put it in the thing. They'd tell you, here's where to get the best pliers. Here's who makes the best axe. Problem is with something like, solar photovoltaics, right? Solar panels. They have to get better, right? That's the point of them. And so there isn't like sort of a perfect solar panel that you could just use for all time. You need this sort of sense of development. One interesting thing about these guys, Steve Jobs said this was his favorite book. It's really kind of a big fat magazine. He said it's his favorite magazine. And a lot of these people went on to help found the internet. So there's a great book called From Counterculture to Cyberculture, which basically traces how this way of thinking, that individual people using tools in networks could in fact sort of change the world. And those people came together to do things like create Apple Computer, create the sort of precursors to the modern web. There was a place called the Whole Earth Electronic Link, otherwise known as the WELL, which was probably the most influential online community. And these people basically moved into the digital space, and we'll see why that's important in a second. This is probably the least heralded story in the history of solar energy, which is that if you really think about how, in particular, solar photovoltaics came to be in the market, there's a few things that happen. One is Bell Labs, which was the huge American telephone company, put a lot of research in R&D. So you have one, it was the preeminent American research institution around some of these things. They put out one of the earliest solar panels. From there, it goes into the space program. So then you have sort of NASA, as well as sort of international partners in space, who go on to continue developing solar photovoltaics. Again, these are like big, heavy metal R&D programs. And then you get to a point in the 1970s where basically all the solar power companies get bought up by the oil companies. So some of the key development that ever happened, some of the most important development that ever happened in the history of solar energy happened inside oil companies. One reason is they had a built-in market for it, which were the oil rigs that were out in the middle of nowhere. They wanted to have a clean source of lighting power out there. And in fact, they turned to solar panels, were able to drive down the price a lot, were able to start scaling these technologies. And they become basically the foundational technological people in sort of the modern solar panel as we came to know it. The last group here in the 1970s is another not quite as heralded story. This is a guy named Art Rosenberg. He was a famed physicist at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab in California, about a mile from where I live. And he and a bunch of other physicists had been coming to Europe a lot because there were European physicists that they collaborated with. And one thing they realized is that Europeans had great lives, a lot like American lives, and they were also using half as much energy as people in the United States. And in the wake of the oil embargo, when everyone is struggling, like where is the leadership on energy? How do we come up with new solutions? These physicists all got together, people who had not previously been involved in energy in any way, and they said, let's learn this system. Let's figure out how this works. And they had remarkable success, particularly in breaking this link that people had between the amount of energy that you used and sort of the development of your country. For basically up until this time, people just thought more energy is better. The more you can use, the better it is, right? I mean, this was the basics of the energy industry, was that you must just keep using more. And one reason is there had been pretty much a very tight correlation between the GDP of a country and how much energy that country used. And so people took that and said, well, all right, if we want to develop, we need more energy. These guys were working from just a different set of precepts. They were physicists, so they turned to thermodynamics, and they said, for a given energy task, like you need to heat this building, you need to have this light provide a certain amount of light so the cameras can work, right? What's the minimum energy that we can use to do that task? They just inverted the way that people thought about what you should do with energy. It was that the minimum amount of energy to perform a task, to give you that energy service, was in fact the right way of doing things. Art in particular was very, very successful in the state of California and in the US more generally. There's sort of a famous story about him, which is that Jerry Brown, who was our governor in California, kind of a big political figure in the US, wanted to shut down this nuclear power plant that was out there, and it was kind of politically, he wanted to shut it down. But he needed to be able to say, well, we're going to be able to save that energy somewhere else. And so he heard that Art had developed this chart which showed sort of refrigerators, right? Refrigerators and energy efficiency. So it was like, this is the energy efficiency up here, and this right here is sort of the price of that refrigerator. And there was no relationship between those two variables. Essentially, energy efficiency was not a part of how refrigerators were sold. So what he said was you could just mandate that refrigerators had to be a certain efficiency, and you would essentially save people money and still have refrigerators at every price point. Because he was able to do that, they rolled out a series of regulations, first on refrigerators, then on just about every other big good that people buy, big white goods that people buy. And if you look at California versus the rest of the US, you'll see that unlike everywhere else where the amount of energy that the US uses keeps going up, for California it sort of flatlines. And they call that the Rosenberg curve. And what's fascinating about this is that only some of that is the regulations, but it's a pretty good chunk. People have tried to figure out exactly how much. It's hard to figure out. And it's basically the work of like one guy, as well as his allies within physics. So you go back to this time, and instead of thinking of the 70s, this time that's just like hippies with solar panels and windmills, you kind of see that each of these different groups of people had something to contribute. The transcendentalists say, we need this planet scale change, right? The tool freaks were like, these mental and digital tools could enable these radical changes in systems working from the outside in, right? It didn't have to be that you would change the central plants. You could actually start on the outside. You could build something like the internet and then work in to change the things that were more central. You also know that like serious corporate R&D is just necessary to the development of these systems. There were a lot of people in the 60s and 70s who thought that solar power research should only occur in small communities, in communes, and it's just not how it had to work. And of course, the thermodynamicists say that the minimum energy for the need should be the goal. So when you think about, spin this forward to our present time period, one of the things you see is like, there's a lot that needs to change. Right? We heard today, there's a lot of challenges facing the energy sector. Most power still comes from fossil fuels, and yet we all want to decarbonize our economies. Climate change progress has been very slow across the world at policy level and elsewhere, and it can sometimes feel daunting. And one of the things I like to think about is, well, we built all of this once, right? And even though we're going to have to rebuild it, we have a tremendous capacity as human beings to build new things, to create new systems that work in new ways. And we're in the midst of that right now. We're kind of overlaying these 21st century digital technologies on top of these networks that really are originated in the 19th century and that kind of create the modern networked city. So a lot of science and technology scholars like to talk about the cities in the 20th century as just being formed of all these networks. And I want to talk to you a little bit about how that came to be. So this is a map of Chicago, obviously one of the biggest cities in the United States. this is as the city is growing, and this whole patch you see here was all of it that burned in one single fire in the 1870s. And you think about problems that we have. Cities at this time were pretty brutal. There's a historian that we'll see a little bit later in this presentation named Richard White at Stanford. He wrote a book about this that recently came out, where he traces sort of how rough were 19th century cities. And he focuses on the US, but it's true across the world. It was this bad that Americans in the early 20th century, so we're talking like 1910, were actually shorter and lived less time than the people who started the American Revolution in like the 1780s. And the reason was environmental pollution had built up in the cities. Things were burning down. There was disease all over the place. You've got fire. This is a map of, very famous map of the way that cholera would spread in a city. This was sort of a bad pump. So you've got these other pumps here where there's no cholera. You've got a pump here, and there is cholera. And people started to say, like, can we actually survive being an urbanized people? I mean, to shrink over 100 years, several inches, that's pretty bad. And to have lower life expectancies after 100 years of urbanization in America is also pretty bad. And all of these cities, as a whole, were struggling with the same problems. How do we have clean water? How do we have clean sewers? How do we have power? How do we have energy? How do we have information that moves around the city? And how do we get sort of public support for it? Richard White's summary is that there was a democracy of defecation. Everybody in the city was in trouble if the whole city wasn't covered by these networks. And so what you start to see is that this starts to happen. This is laying out in New York, Edison's people laying out lines, Thomas Edison's people laying out lines. Of course, at this point, you start to see the centralization of these plants. In the old days, people had their own plant in their house, and then eventually it goes to these sort of neighborhood scale, and eventually it just gets bigger and bigger, and you have fewer and fewer power plants, all supporting the city. You've got lights, you've got to build the distribution, right? It's not just about generation, you've got to get distribution to everyone. One reason I love this image, something to notice, like they would build these towers, which are sometimes called moonlight towers, and they'd put really, really bright lights at the very top. I forgot this thing, touch sensitive. They've got really, really bright lights at the top, and that's they just kind of couldn't figure out that, oh wait, maybe you wanted lights here, and maybe you wanted lights here. So you had to figure out every single piece of this system and how it would actually work. Water, same thing. You had to figure out, all right, how do the sewer lines work? How do you pump all these things? What are the connections between sewer and clean water? What are the connections between water and electricity and power? And one that people usually forget is first you have, telegraph is like already there in the 1850s, and there's a continued expansion of all of these information networks through every city. And that really creates the modern city as we know it. It wasn't just a series of homes and people coming together, it was a series of networks layered on top of each other. And then you get the digital revolution. You get these things coming in layered over the top of those pre-existing networks. So we've seen a lot of different types of new networks layered over. The smart grid is kind of the most obvious, means a lot of different things, but let's just say that it's putting more intelligence into the distribution grid and transmission grid. You've got fiber optics. I know that this is something that Enel is working on, and lots of other companies are like starting to put in these very fast networks. Of course, something that we all appreciate, these 4G and soon to be 5G networks that will allow connectivity anywhere you are in cities at very, very high speeds. And actually, more importantly, will allow all the things that exist in a city to also be connected. And of course, there's the transportation services. One thing we didn't talk about is just you notice all the roads here. Those roads are going to be used differently, and they're going to be used in new ways. Basically, the cities are just becoming more like the internet. You think about the internet allows all this kind of communication. Well, we haven't really tended to think about dams or power plants as part of the communication network, but they're increasingly becoming that way. You think about resilience, we had this big hurricane in Florida. Bunch of the power grid gets knocked out there, but it came back much faster than people had anticipated, and certainly much faster than just a few years ago during Hurricane Sandy in New York, because they had put such an investment into creating more resilient networks, all the things that can mean. It's also adaptive and fluid. I mean, my favorite example of this is there are bike share programs all over the world. Anyone use bike share programs? Seen them in different cities? So normally the way bike share started is they'd have sort of one specific location, right, that had like 10 docks, and you'd bring your bike and you'd dock it there, and then you'd get it out and you'd go along. Well, now they already are becoming more and more fluid. They're already, now there's ones in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere where you just sort of stop the bike wherever you want. You go up to the bike, you scan a little thing, it unlocks for you, you just ride off, and when you're done, you hop off, you lock the bike, and that's it. So they become scattered through the city in a way that helps them reach more and more people and be where people are within the city. And it's just that sort of thing is happening with all kinds of infrastructure. It's going from being sunk into the ground, and it has to work in a particular way, to being able to be spread across the city and merely controlled more fluidly. And the last one, I think, is sort of harder to maybe consider the changes that may come from it. But all of these things out in the world that are attached to one of these networks are just going to start getting more computational. And what I mean by that is that you're going to be able to take their outputs and actually sort of perform operations on them. There's a funny example of this. So basically, every camera, you think of it as sort of like a feed. You think of the camera as just something, that entertainment, more or less. But every camera is also a sensor. So at one point, a professor at Harvard just set up a very simple camera in his class, and he trained it with machine learning to notice if there was someone in a seat or not in a seat. And he was able to get sort of attendance for his class, real attendance for his class, just based on what that camera saw. This sort of thing, every single camera can work like this, right? I mean, once you've got a network, like the 4G and 5G and fiber optic networks, and you've got the images that are coming from all these cameras that are attached to them, they all can be used to do computation. And one of the things that I think we're going to see is, there was this game, SimCity. Maybe some of you played it. A lot of people who love cities had perhaps played this game. And I think what you're going to see is this sort of full-scale kind of digitization of cities. And once you digitize a city like this, you can also simulate the way that it's going to work. So in the future, I imagine that for most city areas, there will be basically a copy of the world up in the cloud, being run by various different companies. And we're going to see an example of that already in play today in just a second. I think what's exciting about going back in history and looking at all these things is you can see that people's ideas about the world changed along with these technologies. And the technologies would change people's ideas, and then the ideas would change people's uses of technology. And I think it's worth thinking about how some of the early signals that we have of these sort of future energy systems, what they might be, and how our ideas about our homes and our mobility may change. So I'll tell you what, I live in Oakland, which is sort of on the eastern side of the San Francisco Bay, so it's kind of right across from San Francisco. Most people call it sort of like the Brooklyn to San Francisco's Manhattan. People in Oakland get a little upset about that, but for an international audience, I feel like that gets the point across. And Silicon Valley is kind of far away. Even though it's only 30 miles, it can take you 2 hours to get there, 2.5 hours. And the reason is this, right? We have infrastructure that's a certain size. The Bay has been booming with people and companies. And so there's this horrible traffic. I mean, Mexico City level traffic. I mean, it is I was at a table the other day. It's hilarious. I didn't expect to tell you guys the story, but it's hilarious. There were all these tech people there, and one of them, literally goes like, "Why hasn't helicopter transportation taken off here? It really feels like it should, I mean, it's gotten like that bad that people are talking about self-flying helicopters and things to just alleviate some of this pressure." So you have this horrible problem. It takes hours and hours and hours. This is how I used to do it. I'd just get in the car, I'd put on my podcast, and I would just go, right? But it's terrible. This is not a fun way. You can't read. It's stressful. The time you get there, it's bad. So now I've started to do something totally different. Now I leave my house. I walk a block to this bike share, just like unlock a bike with my phone. I ride over to the train station, get on the train, swipe in, move across to the bay, hop on another bike share, or maybe I'll get a car sharing, like a Lyft or an Uber, take it over to another train, pop down, and I'm in Silicon Valley in about the same amount of time, maybe an hour and a half. But I haven't had to use my car. I haven't had to sit in any traffic. I haven't had to pull my wallet out of my pocket. It's all been my phone or like a simple RFID chip card. And it's a completely different experience of what it is to move around. And on the way back, maybe I just pick up something called like a car to go. I can just take the car, one of these startups there in the valley. I can drive it back up to the city. Maybe I get a ride from somebody. And the point is that you have the same infrastructure, like the actual steel and cement hasn't really changed very much, but the way that you interact with those things in the city is just like being transformed. And of course, Silicon Valley isn't even the best place for this sort of thing. Dense cities, Madrid, Rome, London. I mean, these places will be absolutely transformed as more and more of these technologies become available. I mean, the way I like to think about it is, essentially your phone has become this kind of magic wand that can unlock all this infrastructure to do different stuff, right? It's got some intelligence embedded in it. It's got some sensors. You can check more easily, even on just like, when's a bus gonna show up? You're gonna know, right then and at that second, right? And I think it's just a way that you get sort of extra leverage out of what's already been built, because we're kind of building inside of the sort of carcass of the old system, right? As we're putting this new one into place. I mean, another thing that I think is going to change a lot is just people's sense of the boundaries of their home. Homes, generally speaking, are kind of sealed off to the outside world, right? You go in and you go out. Power kind of comes in, you use it right there, but power doesn't necessarily go out. There's some really fascinating things that are happening with startups out in Silicon Valley that I think get right to this. For one, Amazon is starting to run programs that allow them to deliver inside your house. So you essentially give them access via a new system, and they can actually go in and put your groceries in your refrigerator, right? So there's this kind of way in which the home is sort of opening up more. Going out the other way, there's a startup called Josephine, which allows people to make food at home and then serve it to their neighbors. So there's this kind of home-to-home kind of networks that are developing. So instead of everything having to run through central parts of the city, its neighborhoods can open up to each other. Of course, there's tool sharing. In Oakland, there's a tool sharing library. So everybody doesn't need a drill. There's one drill at the tool sharing library, and everyone can borrow it. And that kind of means that tool sharing library is a little bit part of my home. I think one of the most significant changes, and I'm going to show you a list in a sec, is just what solar power allows you to do within this kind of context. You're going to have more power on your roof, and that power is going to be both feeding your own house. Maybe it's charging the battery of your electric car. Maybe it's feeding it back to the grid. But you're going to be producing more there, not just consuming. What's fascinating is that big companies are starting to actually think about how to incorporate these services and these ways of doing things into what they sell you. So Airbnb, for example, this is another great example of homes becoming more porous. Airbnb is actually creating their own buildings. They're building buildings that have built into them kind of leases that allow you to Airbnb your place. You think about some of these other things, right? Right now, there's another startup in Silicon Valley that allows you, you need to do a conference call, right? You're running around the city. You need to do a conference call. You want to sit down. You need a quiet place. You can actually just rent out a room to do that now. right? So every space can be sort of put on the market in this kind of piecemeal way, and you can use its facilities just a little bit at a time. Obviously, food, like I was talking about, can be delivered, or it can go out the other way. And there are these buildings right now in San Francisco where when you buy the place, there's no parking, but you're buying sort of a bundle of services along with it. So you're buying a certain amount of like Uber credits, essentially, to use that transportation network, but not have a car. They're bundling in things like dry cleaning services, house cleaning services. Like what a home isn't just the space, but it's actually the services that are attached to that space. The biggest example, or one of what we expect to be kind of the most wild implementation of this idea would be Sidewalk Labs. This was it's a part of Alphabet, which most people still know as Google. And they've been able to contract with the city of Toronto to build this massive, kind of Google city. And no one's really sure precisely what it's going to look like, but all the rumblings, a lot of my friends who do this kind of futures work, Sidewalk Labs has sort of been in touch with them, right? And everything that I hear is like, it's actually going to be pretty wild. Like, I don't think it will be disappointing. Like, I think it will be all the stuff we're talking about here, but sort of taken to the next level. And we'll start to see it developing just over the next couple of years. And I think once people start to see these new ways of living, it's going to be a really significant part of stories going forward. Our homes are going to have these electric autonomous components soon. Obviously, this is sort of like a silly example. This is, the Roomba, which I assume there are European Roombas. But it's, it's just like a little vacuum cleaner, right? That builds a little model of your house, and then it goes around and it cleans stuff up. But from silly things like this, I think we're going to see a lot more robotics and autonomy built into your home. Another silly example, I have a Nest thermostat. The Nest learns how I want the house heated, and then it just automatically does it. So sometimes I've even gone over to turn it up, and it's like turning it up. Like in the morning, it's like, oh, you're up? Great, I'll turn it on for you. And you'll see these homes and spaces becoming more adaptive to just how you live. And the thing that's amazing is you're not really going to do anything. You're not going to program them, because they'll be using machine learning, where basically you're just going to give it a bunch of examples, and the computer will deduce what you want to have happen. This is like the most extreme version of this that I've seen. There's a young woman, she's actually cited in the New York Times Magazine this week too, named Cheno Hart, who's a Berkeley architecture person. What she's trying to figure out is how you can actually have a piece of your actual home be autonomous, how you can have it be powered by electricity, so it can actually move around your neighborhood. Some piece of the house actually sort of detaches an autonomous unit and moves around. She calls it the cyberspace building. What's funny is there's a guy named Bob Lutz, who's a big car guy. It's like one of the big car guys of the 20th century. He recently had a story in Automotive News where he essentially said, we're not actually going to have cars. We're just going to have these sort of modules that link together. There'll be a module in your house. There'll be big fancy modules for going long trips. And those things will stack together. I mean, it's kind of her idea, but coming from like a car guy. So you kind of have this weird situation happening where you have at the most extreme end of sort of architectural thought and the most extreme end of sort of car guyness, they're somehow coming to the same idea that your home is going to be pieces that can break apart in some ways, and your car is going to be pieces that break apart and that you just use as a service. Of course, all this is sort of dependent on artificial intelligence. In particular, the sort of avatar for this right now, the most charismatic robot that exists is the self-driving car. And I want to tell you guys a couple stories about self-driving cars. One reason is, I think people don't quite realize how important electrification is for self-driving cars. For most of the interesting scenarios which I'm going to tell you about, where you have self-driving vehicles in a city, it's much better to have them be electrified than have them have to fill up with gas. And so a lot of what you're seeing is people working with that in mind. Like, I think that is just sort of the baseline, is that this will be how electrification of the fleet works. So I was pretty lucky. This is a picture I took. Google, which is, Alphabet, which also now has this company Waymo. I hate that reorganization. It's like the hardest thing to describe to people. But anyway, this is the self-driving car company that spun out of Google. They have a test track where they have created basically like a model of an American city, where they have roundabouts, and they have different intersections, and they have different like sort of suburban parking situations. But as you can see, there's no actual buildings because the cars don't need that. All they need is like what's on the road. So it's sort of like an entire sort of simulated city, but like minus all the stuff that you or I would want. It's just like a city for robots. Fascinatingly, they have these people who they call foxes, who are essentially stunt drivers, who are actors, whose only audience is the robotic cars. So one of the things I got to do was I got to go out to this place. So, you kind of leave San Francisco, you cross through the mountains into the big Central Valley, and you drive for like an hour and a half through sort of like California agricultural land. I mean, it's really in the middle of nowhere. You cross over some train tracks into what used to be an Air Force base for our big like nuclear bombers. So those have been retired, at least some of them. And we now have this Castle Air Base, which is now the sort of seat of Google Sync. So this is like middle of nowhere America, and this is like sort of the most advanced robotics program going in the world. They've spent upwards of $1.1 billion developing these. Google has, that came out in a lawsuit. And they have these people who are training these cars on very difficult situations. So I got to be the first journalist in the entire world to do dangerous stuff in a self-driving car. What it looked like was this. They basically, the hardest thing for the cars are kind of merges, right? So you're getting onto a highway and you've got to kind of make your way in between a couple cars, and everybody's speeding up and slowing down. I mean, we all know this is when you first learn to drive, you're getting on a freeway or highway, it can be really tough. So we get in these cars, and I mean, we start going like 55 miles an hour, and then they have the stunt drivers cut us off. And the car itself, I mean, it was amazing. I mean, they cut us off with just a couple of feet going like 55 miles an hour, and the car just goes vroom, and just immediately stops, like in this way that was remarkably impressive. And it was the stops were so abrupt because of the way that we were being cut off. I mean, our stuff was like flying around the car. And I had to say, like, if I had known that it would be like that intense, I might not have wanted to be in the car, given that a robot was driving it. But it gave me the sense, and I think they wanted to give me the sense, that this technology has come a really long way. And in fact, the rumor then, this was a couple months ago, the rumor then was that they were going to launch a service very soon, like a public service. And in fact, last week they did just that. They're now outside Phoenix in Arizona, kind of desert area. Pretty soon people will just be able to take a self-driving car wherever they want. I want to show you this. This is sort of what it looks like when I start talking about, that the world is digitized. They, in fact, in this area of Phoenix and everywhere else the cars operate, they essentially laser scan the entire world. They put it into a set of software that allows them to simulate what happens. And then they make the cars just drive over and over different scenarios. So each one of these moving things, they can actually give it different values. So they can make things speed up and slow down. They can add pedestrians. They can add chickens. They can add rabbits. They can add bicyclists, doing any kind of behavior that they want. And this is actually now where most testing occurs for self-driving cars. Is not in the physical world anymore, but literally in this simulation, this digitization of the real world. They call it Carcraft after Warcraft, if anyone knows World of Warcraft, the online game. And it's a remarkable thing. And I think more and more things in cities will have something like this because simulation turns out to be a really, really powerful way of training computers to do things. I think people, because it seemed so improbable at first, that you would be able to have a robot drive a car. I think people have focused too much on sort of the specifics of will they or won't they. I'm convinced they'll be able to drive now, and they'll be able to drive well. But the sort of next step is actually to get to something like this. These are robots that semi-autonomous robots that currently exist. They were made by a company named Kiva, and then Amazon bought them. So Amazon warehouses are filled with these autonomous vehicles. As you can see, these are like stacks of products. They go, they screw themselves in, and they bring it to people. The people take it, they put it in a box, and off they go. They work in these sort of big swarms like this. They don't need light to operate. So on these huge, massive warehouse floors, they can actually turn off the lights except around the edges where the humans are. I always thought this was like sort of an amazing image, that you could like walk out into the center of one of these Amazon warehouses, completely dark, and all these robots are just moving around you. And this is the way I think, like, this is actually a more likely way to think about how self-driving cars and autonomous mobility is going to go, is that it'll be in these collective networks. And where this gets really powerful is when you start to think about the way that vehicles connect into the electrical grid. Because if you think about what a car is, what a self-driving, electrified car is, it's this incredible mobile battery, right, that can go wherever you need to shore up the grid. And on top of that, when they're working in groups like this, they actually can become a whole power plant, right? So if you need to move power around to a certain place, it just becomes this way of balancing loads all across the grid, anywhere you need it, totally mobile. And the interaction between those networks is actually what gets really interesting. And I think the way that these cars seem like they're going to roll out will initially be in fleets. I don't think they're going to sell necessarily to consumers. And that means they're going to be pretty much primed to be able to do exactly this for the big companies that have their own fleet of cars, like, say, a Google, or if you end up with power companies that end up with their own self-driving car fleets, they'll be able to show how this vehicle-to-grid technology can really work. You start thinking about the way it plays into solar. Right? The fact that you could charge your car on solar power and then have it go somewhere else to provide support for the grid. There are just so many exciting things that come from vehicle-to-grid technology. So to kind of wrap up, a lot of space and time. I think we're just about on time here. In the 19th century, you kind of had these local things. You had like local burners, people making their own stuff. A lot of coal was used, right? I mean, this was really the power of the 19th century. You go to the 20th century, and you have kind of a different situation, right? It's mostly powered by oil. Things have become much more centralized. Power plants are sort of in the outskirts of cities, feeding things in. You also have, freeway networks and things that work in the same way, and people own a lot. They own their own home, they own their own car. There's just a lot of like products that you own that tap into these centralized networks. And then you get into the 21st century, and I think what you see is tons of renewables. You see lots of solar, you see lots of wind. Eventually, hopefully, we'll see some other kinds of renewable energy. And it's going to be intelligent. It's going to be able to unlock you're going to be able to unlock different kinds of infrastructure using your phone as a wand, and that allows it to be shared and not individually owned. I'm incredibly excited to have this discussion with all of you, and I think we're going to have a mic, and that's the end of my presentation. Thank you. Should I take this mic? Double mic? Anyone want to lead us off? A brave soul?
I will be the brave.
Okay, you be the brave soul. There you go.
So thank you anyway, because it was really, really interesting. And I was wondering, what do you think? Do you think that actually a multinational company such as Enel can really drive and accelerate and be catalyst for a change, a bit like the whole hair catalog that it was done in the 60s that you quoted, now in 2017?
I mean, it's interesting. the ways that information networks, and social networks intersect with all these things is really interesting. Probably something I didn't tease out as much as I should have in the presentation, but it really matters. Like the way that people come to understand that, solar power is a real thing, that it has become competitive with fossil fuels in many different places, and that information spreads so that it's not just considered to be, kind of a small piece of the future, or the way that wind power has come up in lots of places. I think that's a significant part of it. And I think, it's hard to get people, sometimes it's hard to get people to care about energy, in their day-to-day life. As long as like the lights stay on, then they're fine with it, which is one reason why I like to try and wrap around that energy is a key part of a lot of future technologies, the way that your home works, the way that your car works, and that all of those things will sort of be enabled by these changes in the energy market. So that's been my strategy, at least. I don't know if you guys want to. I know you guys are interested in vehicle-to-grid stuff too, and the future of cars. And I think that's just like getting to places where people really it affects your life, and that you don't just think of it as what you plug into, but something that you could produce at home, something your car could do, and all those kinds of things. Thank you. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
So the conclusion would be that as more share, more connected the societies, you will need less energy, or
I think one might hope. I think when I first got into doing this stuff like 10 years ago, I think a lot of people hoped that, for example, if you had more car sharing, it would take cars off the road, and lots of people predicted that would happen. But as sort of car sharing has gone out there and grown in the way that it has, it takes some cars off the road, but maybe not as many as people hoped. I think that you get more services at like per unit of energy. But the problem has always been with a lot of these things, do you actually end up using less at the end? Or do you just get more services? Do you just use that? Do you just use more? I'm not sure. I mean, I think what I've been more concerned with is like, can you get the share of renewable energy to go up? And can you get the sort of use of resources to be more efficient, particularly in people's homes and buildings? Because right now, there's just like a lot of really inefficient use of buildings. There's all these homes sitting there that use energy, way too much energy for what people are actually doing inside them. I don't know, it's hard to say though. I mean, there's like a lot of academic debates about if you make energy use more efficient, do people use more? Called the rebound effect. I think it should do some good though, right? And it's, yeah.
Okay. Do you have a supercomputer in your pocket?
Mm-hmm.
Everyone has.
Yeah.
Have you heard ever about the nuke barrier term?
The
nuke barrier.
No.
Okay, so hold your hands. Who has the electronic visit card in your supercomputer in pocket?
Oh, I don't.
No one. No one. Yes, I'm only. So it's about smart cities and not adoption the technology to the people. So we have a lot of technologies that around us. But what do you think? What will happen if no one will use it? So.
Right. I mean, so far, a lot of the technologies that we're describing here are things that people have already sort of adopted. I think it's more like taking what people already seem to like and just projecting forward a little bit. I mean, I think with the self-driving car, you start to think about how nice it would be to just be able to have a car on demand anytime you wanted. And what the interiors of those cars may look like. I mean, obviously, if you don't need to have a steering wheel, it's going to be electric, so you don't need a lot of the stuff that's associated with gas engines. I mean, the interior of those cars are going to be amazing. And so far, people have seemed to like it, at least in places where there's enough money to pay for them, to pay for that kind of transportation. And what the big ride-sharing companies like the Ubers and Lyfts and others are expecting is that self-driving technology will drive their costs down a lot and allow them to offer rides much more inexpensively. I mean, to the broader point, I mean, there's a pretty tight relationship between how much something costs and how many people adopt it, right? And that's one of the reasons why in the sort of early part, kind of highlighted that you need these big energy R&D programs, as well as just other technology R&D programs to drive the cost down of things to where people can afford them.
Well, first of all, congratulations for your talk. It was quite enlightening. So thank you very much. And I really like this final slide because I think it reflects clearly the evolution. But what do you think of including transparency in the last one, in the 21st century, as regards consumers? I mean, it's intelligent, it's shared, but for that purpose, we need consumers to understand all these processes. No? For example, here in Spain, consumers do not understand the invoice of their energy suppliers or whatever.
Yeah.
So I believe that. What do you think about consumers in this regard?
Yeah, people have tried to do a lot of things with that, right? I mean, people have tried to redesign energy bills. In fact, seems like there's some pretty good leverage, in particular by telling you if your neighbors use less energy than you do, it tends to drive you to use less energy. And I think it's a good point. I mean, one of the things about having all these sensors and a lot of the machine learning stuff is it allows you to visualize some of these processes and find connections between systems that you might not otherwise see. I think the problem has always been with the transparency stuff that that initial spark of interest has been hard, right? You can design the best bill in the world, but you need people to really care about that, and then you need to have it make an impact on how they use energy, for example. I think that those connections have been tough, aside from getting you competitive with your neighbors.
Thanks again for your conference. It was very enlightening, as you say. I'm from Colombia, and I have one feeling in Latin American countries that we don't have a real sharing economy there, because we have no confidence at all in the other people. So when you say that 21st century, it's about shared, I'm with you. But I can see how to get there, especially in Latin American countries,
Yeah.
And it's all about transparency versus privacy, for example, because we are fighting for privacy, but we are at the same time speaking around, hey, you, government, be transparent. So it's a lot of ironic things going around the world. And I want to ask you if you really think that will be one world that we call the world in 21st century in the next 80 years or something.
I thought about, for this talk, obviously there's this incredible kind of nationalist versus globalist thing happening in so many different countries right now. I mean, Britain, US, obviously here, and other places. I'm sort of choosing to hope that that's a temporary thing, that it's sort of like a blip on this more interconnected world. I think at least in the US, it feels like there are signs that it's kind of, that it will be a blip, that there's a set of people who grew up with a different economy who are more nationalist. I think the hard thing is these technologies just drive people towards interconnection. And there are so many multinational companies. It does feel like it will be one world. And I think, in particular, the imperatives of climate change and just the necessity for the whole world to do something about this, and I think it will be clear, even in the US over the next 10 years, that is what needs to happen. It's got to drive people together, at least around some of these energy issues. And I think with some of the technologies that we discussed here, I just think people are going to really like them. I mean, look at all the smartphones, I mean, everybody has adopted those things. I'm curious, though, in Colombia, what do you think would help with the trust problem, like the peer-to-peer kind of trust problem?
I'm sorry, I took his mic.
I took his mic, but I was just going to comment that. Let me
Sure.
just say,
Yeah,
I
sure.
think in parallel with what is with or exactly dealing with this trust problem, I think there's a technology also developing around this, which is that blockchain technology that we all know about, and I think it's interesting to see how. For example, Bitcoin that's based on blockchain is usually preferred, I know also in South America a lot, for payments where you actually don't trust the government. So, and all the base of these technologies like blockchain is to provide people with a platform to do business where there is no trust.
Right.
So, and in parallel with that, I think it also will help up to make a government and all transactions more transparent if we allow that.
Say that I can see a platform, maybe blockchain, maybe it's a good example, but I can see right now a platform that allow the people from Latin America or from my country to be confident in others. Not only in the government, but in her neighbor, for example. Right. So that I say that because I have another question.
Sure.
And if you allow me, I have.
Yeah.
Okay, it's because I can see this very big enterprise around the world as a part of this movement. I see only the power of the people, the power of the little neighborhood that produced their own energy as the real revolution of the 21st or maybe 22nd century. I think we're going to de-intermediate. We don't want any other intermediate that me and maybe some technology platform that not include humans, and the other. I don't know. So I want to ask you, you really see enterprise, big corporations in the future as intermediaries of you and the people and other people?
I mean, if you think about the way the internet has gone, what did you have, right? You had like an incredibly decentralized system that was built that way. You know, from the beginning of the internet, the web initially ran like that. I mean, a lot of us here were probably around for some early web times. And then what has happened, right? It's been largely enclosed by just a few platforms. And not just sort of in the US and the West, but you look at China and it's like they have just a few platforms that dominate there. I think, you know, one of the things that is scary about the future that I laid out here is it will have network effects, like all those sort of intelligent platforms. I think there will be a lot of value provided by having just a few providers. And that means there'll probably be centralized power within those things. At a really high level, maybe solar power does mitigate it against that a little bit because it can be scaled to any size. And particularly as the sort of what's called the balance of system costs, like all the stuff that's not the panel, as that sort of goes down, becomes easier to install or wherever. It may increase the sort of possibility of decentralizing the energy supply. But most people find it, even if they can do that, they still want to connect it to the grid. And so you're going to have the grid, you know, and usually that means being tied in with companies. I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing, though. I mean, I think if you looking through a lot of the history of how cities have fit together, there are all these times where people they control something themselves, but they're part of this larger network, and it actually seems to work pretty well. So I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but I guess.
I think it's about freedom versus control again, because you know we have Facebook controlling everything. But we have open grid around the world with energy.
Right.
So I'm again with you and think that the grid is necessary, but the grid with freedom of movement.
Yeah.
Right. Because we don't want intermediaries there. We only want to be connected with others.
Well, and there's even some proposals to like force Facebook to have some kind of open standard that allows you to sort of move yourself out of Facebook. And I think certainly arguing for open standards, I mean, the grid has always been the best example of that, like a There's amazing standards that allow anyone to sort of to plug in the same ways. And I hope our social networks will evolve that way. And I think if you look at what's happening in the US with Congress getting interested in how these platform companies work, they had them testifying in hearings over the last month. I think you may see some movement towards that, towards them opening up that the way their infrastructure works.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I changed the theme. I'd like to know what you're thinking about the energy security, in particularly in developing world. We're talking about a lot of technologies, but I don't know if you agree, but this kind of technology today is available here in Europe or United States. And how and what you're thinking about these technologies can be available to achieve energy security in developing countries?
Yeah, I think they may just, a lot of the developing countries may just build their grid very differently. And there's actually a real opportunity in that. Like at my house right now, right outside, they're putting in new gas lines. And it's taken like 12 guys, 3 months, working like 7 days a week. Like once you've got the infrastructure in, it's hard to change it. And you have to kind of work backwards. And I think a lot of the hope has been that the developing world would go sort of a different way. If you sort of look at Chinese coal use, it doesn't look that way right now. But you do also see the Chinese, for example, like just investing in massive amounts of wind and solar power, which have really changed the whole global market for these technologies because there's such scale that you can really drive costs down, which then has made it cheaper for everybody. So I think they're just going to build a different system. And sort of like, a friend of mine was traveling in East Africa recently and said around every cell tower, like out in the middle of nowhere, there's like media distribution, like companies, like, single entrepreneurs, like all around. And that's kind of how people are getting their media. There's just like these different kiosks with like music and movies and whatever out there all around the cell tower. And like, we just never had that pattern of development in Europe and in the US. And yet that's just going to be sort of the basis of their, media distribution network. So it's just sort of like, cell tower to cell tower. And I think you could see some similar things, particularly because solar can scale up and scale down really easily. That'd be my best answer. Oh.
So thank you very much. It was a very interesting discussion, and exactly many guys also asked about the security, how we go on, and so on. So I have my very good friend Bernard Picard as a solar pilot.
Mm-hmm.
He's today in CIF and the COP23, and we have a lot of discussions. Exactly, maybe 5 years ago in Moscow, with with our Prime Minister Medvedev. About what is going on after the oil gas era. Mm-hmm. And the main problem that we saw after his flight over the world on the Sono plane, that it's breaking some limits, we can use it and so on, but what's going on for ordinary people? So that was my example with the electronic visit card. So that would be a great for the infrastructure companies to give the people the ability to go to the shop and buy the energy. I mean, to buy, like IKEA offers solar panels in Britain and UK maybe already, I don't know. But so go somewhere and buy something that will give you independence, give you the ordinary thing that you do every day. So just in the science fiction, we just discussed with someone here before the starting that, next maybe 10 years you will stop your car when the price for energy will be peaking and plug it to sell your energy, and everyone will stop. So it will show the collaboration of the people going together, because today, some leaders like Schwarzenegger, Bernard Picard saying to everyone, let's go to be sustainable. But what we do, everyone to be how we collaborate, how we open. So I think that is I like some good examples. For example, I say why people eat hamburgers, because we eat it by both hands like monkeys. We like to do, and it's natural for everyone. So we taste all the feelings. So what we should do with the energy companies and leaders, making the living in a green economy, in a clean energy, such ordinary like we eat hamburgers.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I think the thing that has changed energy politics in the U.S., which is sort of what I noticed, is just like the prices come down. I think when you didn't have these alternatives, you didn't have renewables that were, had fallen so much in price, you were really asking people to make a huge sacrifice to commit to a renewable world. Now, I mean, what's the big deal? It's like kind of, at this point, all future investments in production look like they're going to be renewable units or backup units for renewable units, and that's kind of all it's going to look like. And I think once you've got that situation, I think the politics of it actually gets a lot easier versus what it was in 1985 or something, where you were like, all right, we're going to have energy prices double, I know that's sort of like a very market-oriented answer, but it's also because our politics is broken in the U.S., so it's hard to imagine that changing a lot. Yeah.
Yes, I was thinking about your presentation. I have a question. I don't know if you have the answer, but watching what you say about the future of the world, don't you think that sometimes Silicon Valley people doing all these future things live in a kind of bubble? I'm not talking about the stock prices bubble.
No.
What do you think?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think Silicon Valley is like a crazy, strange bubble, right? I mean, I think the hardest thing is to sort out the things that are bubbling up there, which of them actually go to the rest of the world and which are just going to be there, Because it's so weird. You could be sitting in a Starbucks in Mountain View, and there'll be 3 different self-driving cars that go by outside, That's weird. But some of the things really do escape the valley, right, and do go on to become these things. I mean, the thing that I just keep thinking about is, between San Francisco and Seattle are the 5 most valuable companies in the world now, outside of Saudi Aramco, right? I mean, that's it. They're all there on the Pacific coast. So it is a bubble, but it's clearly a bubble that can make things that people across the world want. To the maybe deeper question of it, the problems of diversity and inclusion in Silicon Valley are not getting better. In fact, they're getting worse in a lot of ways. There's not enough women in the companies and in positions of leadership. There's not enough black people. There's not enough brown people. It's really tough. And that's the bubble I worry the most about, because you do want to make things that everybody in the world can use, and not just things that literally people from 24 to 34 with incomes over $200,000 a year who are elite white guys who went to Ivy League schools want to use. And a lot of, you guys hear about Juicero out here. It was a $300 juicing machine, but it turned out that what they were sending you was essentially a Capri Sun filled with juice, and all the machine did was squeeze it out of the packet. There's a lot of things like that get made in Silicon Valley. I think most of the people who are working on this stuff are more serious technologists than that. They're not just messing around with a startup because they went to business school. They're these self-driving car people. I mean, they're serious roboticists. It's just a different kind of person. And I'm not as worried about the roboticist bubble. I'm more worried about the broader culture or lack of culture and diversity in Silicon Valley.
So in Brazil, we have a government that is really corrupt. So we can't rely on the government to bring innovation to the country. So we tend to rely on companies. But the country is very regulated. For example, we have a tax for electric cars that it's bigger it's greater for electric cars than for fossil fuels.
Huh.
Like gasoline is cheaper for manufacture a car, to buy a car. I don't know. I keep imagining this future for where everything is shared, and like Tesla is planning to release cars on the grid, so you can buy the car and then pay your car renting during the day.
Right.
I don't know, but is this profitable for the companies? I mean, Volkswagen is instead of manufacturing cars for selling the cars, creating a grid. I don't know.
Right. I mean, they certainly think so. Some of it is they're following what happened in the software industry, right? In software, you used to buy, you remember this? Like Windows 95, you'd buy a box with like some CDs in it, you know? But now it's all just like stuff you access. It's a service. And I think a lot of people think that many things will go the way that software did, because all these things are fundamentally, like at the bottom, they're all about their software. One interesting thread that I didn't talk about, but that I am like following, like the sort of movement to have more co-op companies. I was at a thing called Foo Camp, which is sort of like an intellectual technology conference that's run out of the Bay, and there were so many people there from different like labor movements, labor economists, labor historians, all these people who are kind of trying to imagine this world where you're developing these technologies, but you're developing them with different corporate structures, where they're owned by the people who work there, or there's just some other ownership method. I think that stuff is really, really interesting, because one thing Silicon Valley is trying to figure out is like, what is its relationship to work, right? I mean, if you're out in Silicon Valley right now, people are all talking about how there's not going to be jobs, there's not going to be work. It's like kind of a meme to talk about universal basic income, which I know has gotten some traction in some European countries too. The reason is like they just think robots are going to do all the work, more or less. And I think it's an opportunity to develop companies in more collaborative ways that maybe try and employ people. You know, like a lot of Silicon Valley companies, the point is to not employ people. And you can imagine building different corporate structures that would try to hire people, try to create jobs. So I think it's an answer to a lot of these. Different corporate structures right now are considered one of the most exciting things, I think, in San Francisco, outside of technological development.
But when we think about energy production, you think it's profitable to, I mean, create large spaces with solar panels, or just an initiative where you can have solar panels in people's homes?
I think both things can work. I mean, to date, it has been cheaper to do big fields of solar panels because you get some economies of scale in the installation. But that's something people have been trying to drive down this whole time. How do you make it easier to get solar panels onto your house? How do you integrate them into building materials? All those things I don't know exactly how the profitability of all those things will go, like those two things. But I think both things will coexist in the future. I really do. And that it won't all be produced centrally or all be produced on roofs, but there'll be a combination of those things. Yeah. Couple more, if there's any. Yeah.
Just one more.
Sure.
What do you think about the nexus between water and energy in the future?
Between
water.
Water and energy. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, they've long been tied together, right? Those two things have huge implications. One of the major advantages of solar in lots of places is it's like very water efficient. You don't need a lot of water to produce solar power. I think that like in a state like California right now, basically California pumps water from north to south. And it's like a huge percentage of all the total energy consumed in the state just goes pumping water north to south. There's I mean, there's literally huge pumping plants and huge canals and all these things, and just moving water around is very expensive. And so the solution that a lot of people have tried to come up with, and in fact people in Southern California have implemented this quite well, is just like massive efficiency. I mean, like the roof of this building, right, uses gray water to do the plants. I mean, doing that in every available situation makes a ton of sense. And I think people tend to think of that as just being good because you're not using as much water, but when you're not using water in a state like California, you're also saving energy. So you get like this sort of synergistic effect. And I think in the long term, hopefully you don't try and move water around in that way, and you just get better at capturing it. I mean, the countervailing force there is that climate change is changing a lot of the patterns of that stuff in a state like California and other places, which makes it harder to sort of predict exactly how that's going to work. But obviously, they're incredibly tied together. The water infrastructure is hard to make more flexible. Like, if you've got a canal, it can basically do one thing, you know, like that's it. And so I didn't talk about it much here because it's sort of functioning with different principles in a lot of ways. Oh, yeah? We'll take these two, and then, yeah,
okay,
cool.
Okay. I would like to know what you think about how it will influence political structures and etc. The direct votes, the possibility to participate through blockchain technology, in voting, in citizen participation, and so on, related to what you talked about.
So I will say most of what I know about blockchain is that, like,
not just blockchain. I mean, citizen participation. Forget about blockchain this time, but citizen participation and so on, direct votes, and what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, there's always been this hope that because you have network technologies, that you'll be able to have more of a direct democratic process. It just like hasn't worked like that, though, by and large. I just think it turns out that the networks that people create, political networks they create within social networks, are much more complicated than just sort of like one person, one vote. And what you end up with in almost all cases is you get sort of a lot of people and then these really big nodes, right? And it almost ends up becoming like a broadcast structure. So I have a friend at The Atlantic who basically says nothing really ever goes viral in the sense of like spreading from one person to one person to one person. It's more that big nodes, big broadcast nodes working on social media, like just like the big media companies, influencers, et cetera, they actually drive things out, which is not really the same as like one person to one person to one person. And so basically, I don't think that we've seen positive changes to democracy from the social networks themselves. One historical fun note was there was a guy who quite seriously suggested that votes within the UN should be apportioned based on your total amount of energy available. So both your like oil and coal, but also your like solar availability and your wind. And you could see that maybe in the far future that becomes like energy becomes like the basis for international policy in some ways, as people realize it's more important in a more scarce world.
I'm not sure if this question is for you or maybe it's for all that we are here together. Because we are speaking about create a new sustainable world. And you speak before about, you are worried about the diversity in Silicon Valley. And this is a question for all that we are here. Please see around you. You can see that you all that are thinking about the new good world are men, white, European, or this kind of. And my question is, sorry, I'm a little bit. Yeah. You really think that we are going to create a sustainable world without the half of the population here? And we have not all the point of view of all the people who consume this energy and who use these streets and who use this car, this public transportation the old people who use the old transportation, this kind of. So it's a question for everybody that it's here. I'm, I think, the unique woman in this circle.
Yeah.
So how it's possible to get at sustainable diversity in this innovation world?
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely a problem that needs to be solved, needs to be fixed. More work needs to be done. I think there's, yeah, I mean, it's something that there's a great group for anyone who's interested called the KPOR Center, which Oakland is considered kind of like the politically radical part of the Bay, which is where I live, and the KPOR Center is headquartered there, and what they've been doing is not just sort of like pushing Silicon Valley to change, but developing a series of programs and implementable things to get more women in the room, to get more non-Europeans
It's
in the room.
not just women. I feel like Santiago.
Yeah.
I feel like Santiago. I feel that the people do a lot of sustainable things around the world to get a better world, to keep the energy, to keep the planet. You know that the big companies, the big government, not in Brazil, maybe right now, maybe not here in Spain, but they have to follow the way of the people that we really want create a sustainable world. But to get a sustainable world, we have to change the mind, and we are not going to get with this kind of just one point of view of the 20% of the population in the world, I think.
So I think
I think
we've done.
Yeah.
And Alexis, thank you so much.
Oh,
It's been
thank you.
a real pleasure, and I'm sure that everyone really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks.
And thank you all for being here, and to the people also that is following us on streaming. Please keep on being updated on the next appointment on the Enel Focus On. We will be updating on enel.com and on our Twitter account, Enel Group. The next appointment is going to be in Chile, in Santiago, at the beginning of next year, and then we will keep on being on tour all around the world. Thank you again, and see you soon.